Sound of a low, mournful wind. You ever feel like you're running from something? Not just a bad memory, but something with teeth. Something that follows you in the quiet and watches you from the trees. Today, I've got a story for you about a woman who built a wall around her life, brick by painful brick. She thought she was safe. She thought she was alone. She was wrong on both counts. And the man who found her wasn't there to save her. He was there because their pasts were tangled together in a knot of secrets and blood. If you stick with me to the end, I promise you a story of grit, betrayal, and the kind of justice that only comes after the world has tried to burn you down. Let's get into it. The wind out in the Wyoming Basin doesn't just blow, it whispers. It tells stories the rocks have heard and the dirt remembers. For Willa Gray, it was the only voice she'd trusted in 3 years. She was out on her fence line, the weak March sun doing little to fight the chill. The barbed wire was old, rusted, and snapped. Just another thing in her world that was broken. She worked with a quiet rhythm, her gloved hands sure and steady. Pull, twist, tighten. She didn't grunt or sigh, waste a breath. Every move was efficient, practiced. This was her life now. Silence, work, and land that asked no questions. She'd claimed this patch of forgotten earth with nothing but a bedroll and a past she was determined to bury deeper than any fence post. She was kneeling, using her weight to stretch a new line of wire taut when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not an animal. Not the wind. It was the clumsy scuff of a boot on stone just down the slope, near the cottonwoods. Instantly, her body went rigid. Her hand didn't tremble as it slid down and rested on the cold steel of the revolver at her belt. The motion was as natural as breathing. She hadn't survived this long by being careless. She rose slowly, using the fence post as cover, her eyes scanning the tree line. And then she saw him, a man, and a mule. The mule was down on one knee, and the man was kneeling beside it, murmuring something soft and low. He was Apache. She could tell by the single, thick braid that lay against his shoulder and the way he held himself, like he was part of the land itself, not just a visitor. He wasn't looking at her. He was focused on the animal, checking its leg, his movements calm and unhurried. Willa stayed frozen, her thumb resting on the hammer of her pistol. Trespassers weren't common out here, and they were never welcome. This was her sanctuary, her fortress, and he had just crossed the line. He let the mule rise at its own pace, then, without any surprise at all, he looked right at her. His eyes met hers across the 100 yards of scrub and frost-hardened dirt. There was no wave, no smile, just a simple, silent acknowledgement. It was a look that said, "I see you, and I know you see me." It unnerved her more than any threat. He knew she was armed. He knew she was watching him, and he didn't seem to care. He just turned, took the mule's lead, and walked away, disappearing back into the trees as quietly as he'd appeared. Willa didn't lower her hand from her gun for a long time. Who was he? What did he want? People didn't just wander onto this land by accident. They came looking for something, or someone. By the time dust settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple, she'd finished the fence. She hauled a sled full of kindling back to her small, sturdy cabin, the path worn smooth by her own 2 feet. But as she approached the porch, she stopped dead. The smoke rising from her chimney wasn't hers. It was too fresh, too thick. Someone had been in her home, her heart hammered against her ribs. She dropped the sled rope, her hand flying back to her revolver as she crept toward the cabin. The door was closed, just as she'd left it. But something was on the top step. A small bundle wrapped in oiled canvas and tied with a leather strip. She circled it like a wolf, checking for tracks, for any sign. There was nothing. Just the bundle, sitting there, waiting. Cautiously, she nudged it with the toe of her boot. It was soft. She crouched, untied the knot, and peeled back the canvas. Inside was a strip of jerky, smoked over green wood. It was still warm. A peace offering? A warning? She looked out at the darkening trees, her eyes straining to see any movement. Nothing. Just the endless whisper of the wind. She took the bundle inside, her gun still in her hand. She didn't light a lamp, letting the darkness wrap around her like a familiar cloak. She didn't need anyone. She hadn't for years. But as she stood there, the scent of wood smoke and roasted meat filling her small cabin, a cold realization washed over her. The canvas wrapping. It was familiar. Faded and worn in a way she knew deep in her bones. It was a piece of her mother's old shawl, the one she was wearing the day she threw Willa out. How did a total stranger, an Apache man out in the middle of nowhere, have a piece of her mother's shawl? The fortress she had built around herself suddenly felt like it was made of glass. The man wasn't a trespasser, he was a messenger, and the past she had tried so hard to bury was no longer in its grave. It had come looking for her. The next morning broke cold and clear. The unsettling gift on her porch had kept Willa awake most of the night, her revolver lying on the small table beside her cot. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the trees, sounded like a footstep. She felt watched, hunted. She checked her trap lines at dawn, moving through the gray light with a heightened sense of awareness. In the third snare, she found a young coyote, its hind leg caught tight in the steel jaws. It was thin, ribs showing, and its teeth were bloody from chewing at the trap. It snarled weakly as she approached, but it didn't have the fight left in it. Willa knelt a few feet away, her rifle resting across her knees. She didn't like killing things that didn't need to die. But looking at the animal, trapped and bleeding, she saw a reflection of her own life. Sometimes the only mercy left was a quick end. She raised the rifle, exhaled, and the shot echoed across the silent basin. By the time she had reset the trap and carried the carcass back, the sun was up. As she neared the cabin, her eyes immediately went to the porch, and her blood ran cold. There was another bundle. Same oiled canvas, same leather knot. Her hand instinctively went to her pistol again. This was a game, and she didn't know the rules. She approached slowly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. What was it this time? Another piece of her past? She unwrapped it. Inside wasn't food. It was a tool. A small hand axe, a hatchet. The wooden handle was new, smooth and clean. The steel blade was freshly sharpened, gleaming in the morning light. It was perfectly balanced, a fine piece of work. But it wasn't the quality that made her stomach clench. It was the design, the way the head was forged, the slight curve of the handle. It was identical to the hatchet her stepfather used to carry, the one he kept by the fireplace, the one he'd threatened her with more than once. This wasn't a gift. This was a message, a very, very clear one. I know who you are. I know what you did. Fury, cold and sharp, replaced her fear. She was done being the hunted. She grabbed the hatchet, its weight feeling both foreign and sickeningly familiar in her hand, and stormed off into the trees without even grabbing her coat. She would find this man, and she would get answers. She found him by a small creek, stripping bark from a cedar limb with a knife. His mule grazed peacefully nearby. He didn't seem surprised to see her crashing through the undergrowth, her face a mask of rage. "You leave something on my porch?" she demanded, her voice tight. She stopped a good 20 feet away, the hatchet held tight in her hand. He didn't even turn around. "No one else out this far." She held up the hatchet. "What is this? Some kind of sick joke?" "Wasn't a joke," he said, his voice calm. "Then what was it?" "A blade," he said simply. She took a step closer. "You think I need your tools? You think I can't take care of myself?" "No," he said, finally turning to look at her. His face was unreadable, his dark eyes steady. "I think you have for a long time." His words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the anger right out of her. There was no mockery in his voice, just a simple statement of fact. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "How do you know me?" "I don't know you," he replied, "but I know the look of someone who cuts their own wood, and I know the look of someone tired of proving it." "You're following me," she accused. "Watching," he corrected. "I saw you once. You saw me back. That's enough." The piece of her mother's shawl, the hatchet that looked like her stepfather's. This wasn't a coincidence. This man knew things. He was pulling at threads she had torn from her life years ago. "I don't owe you anything," she said, taking a step back. He nodded. "Wasn't asking." She looked from his unyielding face down to the hatchet in her hand. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, chilling unease. She had to know more. She had to know what he wanted. That night, she waited until the moon was high, and his campfire had burned down to embers. She moved through the woods like a ghost, silent and unseen. She needed to know who this man was. She crept up to his small, makeshift camp. His mule was tethered, and he was asleep, wrapped in a blanket near the fire. His saddlebags were leaning against a log. Her heart pounding, she slipped into the camp. She eased open the leather flap of one of the bags, her fingers searching inside. She felt papers, a small tin of coffee, a whetstone. And then her fingers brushed against something else, a small rectangular object wrapped in cloth. She pulled it out. It was a small, tin-frame photograph. She held it up to the faint moonlight, her breath catching in her throat. It was a picture of her. She was 17, standing in front of the old farmhouse, her face sullen and defiant. It was taken just a few months before she ran, before the fire poker, before everything. This man hadn't just stumbled upon her. He hadn't been sent by her mother. He had been looking for her, for a long, long time. And he had a picture of the girl she used to be, the girl she had killed and buried years ago. The photograph felt like a brand in her hand. It wasn't just a picture, it was proof. Proof that her past had a longer reach than she'd ever imagined. She stood there in the moonlight, the sleeping man a few feet away, and 1,000 questions screamed in her mind. Who was he? A lawman? A bounty hunter? Someone sent by him? She didn't run back to her cabin. Running was what the girl in the photograph would have done. The woman she was now, she confronted things head on. She walked back into his camp, the photograph held out in front of her. She kicked the log near his head. His eyes snapped open. He didn't jump or reach for a weapon. He just looked at her, then at the photo in her hand, and a deep sigh escaped his lips. He sat up slowly. "You've got questions?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I've got a gun," she countered, her voice dangerously low. "And you've got about 10 seconds to start talking before I use it. Where did you get this?" She shook the photograph. He looked at the fire for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "My name is Dan," he said finally. "And you're right, I was looking for you, but not for the reason you think. Try me. I was hired to find your mother," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "She disappeared a few years back. The man who hired me, he wants something she took from him." Willa's blood ran cold. There was only one man her mother would run from. "Silas," she whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "Her stepfather." Dan nodded slowly. "He's alive, Willa. He's been looking for your mother ever since she left. He believes she told you where she hid it." "Hid what?" "A lockbox. He says it contains papers, proof of ownership for a lot of land he acquired. He's a powerful man now, owns half the valley north of here. But without those papers, his claims are worthless." It all clicked into place. The piece of shawl, Dan must have gotten it from her mother before she vanished again. The hatchet, a cruel reminder of Silas's power. He wasn't just sending a message. He was issuing a threat. A new kind of fear, hot and sharp, pierced through Willa's hardened exterior. Silas was alive, and he was looking for her. She had to know what Dan's role was in all this. She had to test him. A lie formed on her lips, a dangerous gamble. "He's not going to find her?" Willa said, her voice flat and cold. "And he's not going to find his lockbox?" She stared Dan straight in the eye. "Because I know where his papers are, and I also know something you don't." She let the silence hang in the air for a beat. "Silas isn't looking for me," she said, the lie tasting surprisingly easy. "Because the night I left, I did more than just run. I picked up that fire poker, and I didn't stop swinging until he stopped moving. I killed him, Dan. I buried him myself in the woods behind the house." She watched his face, looking for any flicker of surprise, of shock, of betrayal, anything that would tell her whose side he was really on. But Dan's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch. He just held her gaze, a strange, almost pitying look in his dark eyes. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the crackle of the dying fire. Then he spoke, and his words shattered her carefully constructed lie, and the fragile sense of control she thought she had. "That's a good story," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But that's not what happened." How could he know? How could this stranger possibly know what happened in that room 17 years ago? Unless, unless he wasn't just a hired hand. Unless his connection to Silas was deeper and darker than he was letting on. Before she could demand an answer, a sound cut through the night. The sharp, nasty crack of a twig breaking under a heavy boot. It came from the trees just beyond the firelight. Dan was on his feet in an instant, moving with a speed that startled her. "Get back," he hissed, pushing her behind him. Out of the darkness, a voice drawled, lazy and menacing. "Well now, what do we have here?" Looks like the savage finally cornered his little stray. Three men stepped into the firelight. The one in the middle was Milan Pike, the son of the general store owner from town, a known bully and a snake, and he was flanked by two rough-looking men she didn't recognize. Pike's eyes were fixed on Willa, a smirk playing on his lips. "Heard you were good with a fire poker, sweetheart," Pike sneered. The lie she had just told Dan echoed in the cold night air. Someone had been talking. Her past wasn't just a ghost anymore. It was here, and it had brought friends. Willa's world narrowed to the three figures standing at the edge of the firelight. Pike's words confirmed her worst fear. Her secret wasn't a secret at all. Silas had been spreading his own version of that night for years, painting her as a wild, unstable girl. And now that story had followed her here. "Get off this land, Pike," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Her hand was on her revolver, but she knew 3-1 were terrible odds. Pike chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "This ain't your land, sweetheart. Not really. See, a man with a lot of money, Mr. Silas, he's been buying up all these forgotten claims, including this one." He waved a piece of paper. "This says I'm here on official business, to escort you back to town for questioning." It was a lie, and they all knew it. This wasn't an official visit. It was an abduction. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Willa said, pulling her revolver from its holster. Pike's smirk widened. "I was hoping you'd say that." He and his men started to spread out, circling the small camp. Willa braced herself, her eyes darting between the three men. But Dan hadn't moved. He stood between her and Pike, his body relaxed, almost casual. He hadn't drawn a weapon. He hadn't even raised his voice. "This doesn't concern you, Apache," Pike spat at Dan. "This is between me and the girl." Dan was silent for a moment. Then he looked at Pike, and his eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. He spoke, but it wasn't in English. He said a single phrase in his native tongue. The words were quiet, but they cut through the night air with the force of a whip crack. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. Pike froze mid-step. The color drained from his face. His two goons, who had been advancing confidently, stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes wide with what looked like genuine fear. They looked at Dan not as a man, but as something else entirely, something ancient and dangerous. Pike swallowed hard, his bravado gone. He stared at Dan, then shot a nervous glance at Willa. "This ain't over," he stammered, before turning and practically scrambling back into the darkness, his men right behind him. Willa stood in stunned silence, her gun still raised. She stared at Dan's back. What had he said? Who was this man that a single sentence could send three armed thugs running for their lives? Dan turned to face her, his expression grim. "They'll be back," he said, "and they'll bring more men. Pike works for Silas. He's been his eyes and ears in this territory for years." "What did you say to him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dan hesitated. "I told him who my grandfather was. Pike's family has been in this valley a long time. They know the old names, the old stories." He looked out into the darkness where Pike had disappeared. "And they know who my family is." The pieces were starting to fall into place, forming a picture she didn't understand. Dan wasn't just a tracker. He was someone of importance, someone whose name carried weight and fear. "Your family," she said. "What does your family have to do with Silas?" Dan finally looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a deep, old pain in his eyes, a pain that mirrored her own. "Silas didn't just hurt you and your mother, Willa," he said, his voice low and heavy with history. "Before he ever met you, he destroyed my family. The land he's built his empire on, the claims he holds, it was all ours. He stole it. He used forged papers and crooked lawmen to take everything from us. He reached into his own coat and pulled out a worn, folded piece of leather. He opened it carefully. Inside was a tattered yellow document. "This is the real deed," he said. "The one my grandfather filed. But it's not enough. We need proof of the forgery. Proof of his crimes." He looked at her, his eyes intense. "That lockbox your mother hid? It doesn't just have his papers in it. My father believed it held Silas's ledger, a record of every bribe, every swindle, every life he destroyed to build his fortune, including my father's." Willa stared at him, her mind reeling. This whole time she thought she was running from her own past, but she had run right into the middle of his. Their stories weren't just similar. They were two sides of the same bloody coin, with Silas at the center. "The deed," she said, thinking of the small tin box in her cabin. "The paper my mother gave me when she sent me away." Dan's eyes widened. "She gave you a deed?" Willa nodded slowly. "She told me it was for this land. A parting gift. Something to start over with." "No," Dan said, shaking his head. "This land was worthless then. Unclaimed. That paper? Willa, that can't be what you think it is." A storm was brewing, both in the sky above and inside Willa's cabin. The wind howled, rattling the shutters, a perfect echo of the turmoil in her heart. She and Dan had made it back from his camp just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Now the full force of a prairie storm was upon them. She placed the small tin box on the table between them. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. For 17 years, this box had been a symbol of her banishment, a worthless deed to a worthless piece of land. A final, bitter gift from the mother who had chosen a monster over her own daughter. She pulled out the folded slip of paper and carefully unfolded it. It was old, the creases worn thin. It was a deed, just as she'd always thought. But the plot of land described wasn't the rocky barren patch she was living on. It described a rich, sprawling territory to the north. Silas's territory. Dan leaned closer, his eyes scanning the document. "This is it," he whispered, his voice filled with a reverence she didn't understand. "This is a copy of the original claim, my family's claim. But why would my mother give this to me?" Willa asked, confused. "Maybe she was trying to give you a weapon," Dan said. "Maybe she knew even then that you'd need it." As he spoke, Willa's eyes fell upon something she'd never noticed before. Faint pencil markings on the back of the deed. They were almost invisible, faded with time. She turned the paper over. It wasn't just writing. It was a map, a crude, hand-drawn map of her own property. There was the creek, the ridge, the stand of cottonwoods, and there was an X marked over a spot she knew well, the old abandoned stone well at the far edge of her property, a place she never went near. Beneath the X, there was a single line of writing in her mother's familiar script. The words made the hair on her arm stand on end. "He knows, don't let him find it." The lockbox. It wasn't in some far-off town or buried in another state. It was here. It had been here the whole time, just a few hundred yards from where she slept every night. Her mother hadn't just sent her away to a random piece of land. She had sent her to guard the one thing that could destroy Silas. She hadn't been cast out. She had been given a post. Suddenly the barn door, which she'd failed to secure properly in her haste, was ripped from its leather hinges by a furious gust of wind and slammed against the side of the cabin with a deafening crash. The sound was like a gunshot. "They're here," Dan said, his voice grim. He peered through a crack in the shutters. "It's Pike, and he brought the whole town with him." Willa looked. In the flashes of lightning she could see them. A dozen riders, their slickers shining in the rain, circling the cabin. They weren't waiting for the storm to pass. They were moving in. Silas had grown impatient. They were trapped. The storm was raging outside, and inside the truth of the last 17 years had finally cornered her. The map on the table was their only hope, and the secret it held was buried under the same earth that was about to become a battlefield. The cabin felt like a drum, the rain hammering a frantic beat on the roof. Outside, the circle of riders was tightening, their figures illuminated by flashes of lightning. They weren't attacking. Not yet. They were waiting, containing. "They know we're not going to run in this storm," Dan said, his voice a low rumble. They'll wait for first light, then they'll move in. They think they have us trapped. They do, Willa said, her eyes fixed on the map. The X seemed to pulse in the flickering lamplight. The well is on the other side of the property. We'll never make it there without them seeing us. We're not going around, Dan said. He tapped a point on the map. There's an old storm cellar just behind the barn. My father dug it years ago, before all this. It connects to a washout gully that runs all the way to the creek bed. The creek passes right by the old well. It was a desperate plan. A tunnel. Right under their noses. Will it still be clear? Willa asked. Only one way to find out, he said, his eyes meeting hers. We have to get that ledger. It's the only thing that will make them listen. It's the only thing that matters more than us. They moved quickly. Willa gathered what she could. Her revolver, a box of cartridges, a small oil lamp. Dan grabbed the hatchet from the porch, the one he'd given her, its weight now feeling like a promise rather than a threat. The back door of the cabin opened into the teeth of the storm. Wind and rain lashed at them as they slipped out, using the chaos of the weather as cover. The barn was a dark shape against the gray sky. They ran, heads down, mud sucking at their boots. The riders on the far side of the cabin wouldn't see them. But it was a risk. They found the cellar doors behind the damaged barn, half buried under years of dirt and leaves. They were swollen with damp, but Dan put his shoulder into it, and with a groan of protesting wood, one of the doors gave way. The air that rose from the darkness below was cold and smelled of damp earth and forgotten time. Dan lit the small lamp, its flames sputtering in the wind. He went first, the hatchet held ready. Willa followed, pulling the heavy door closed above them, plunging them into absolute darkness, save for the tiny pool of light from the lamp. The tunnel was narrow and low. They had to crouch as they moved, the damp stone walls brushing against their shoulders. Water trickled down from the ceiling, and the sound of the storm above was a muted roar. It felt like being buried alive. My father told me stories about this place, Dan said, his voice echoing in the confined space. He said the earth keeps secrets, that it remembers the truth, even when men try to bury it. They moved in silence for what felt like an eternity. The air grew colder, and the tunnel began to slope downwards. Then ahead they saw it, a faint gray light, the end of the tunnel. It opened into the washout gully, just as Dan had said. The gully was a torrent of muddy water now, a temporary river carved by the storm. They scrambled out of the tunnel into the raging storm. The gully provided some cover, its high walls shielding them from view. The old stone well was just 50 yards away, a dark, circular shape against the landscape. They ran, the mud trying to pull them down with every step. They were almost there. Willa could see the heavy wooden lid that covered the well. And then a voice shouted from the ridge above them. There! In the gully! They'd been spotted. A shot rang out, the bullet kicking up mud just inches from Willa's feet. Pike and his men were on the ridge, dismounted, rifles raised. They were exposed, pinned down. Get to the well, Dan yelled, shoving her forward. He fired his own pistol up at the ridge, not aiming to hit, but to make them take cover. It bought them a few precious seconds. They scrambled the last few feet and collapsed behind the low stone wall of the well, heart pounding, gasping for breath. Rifle fire splintered the wood of the trees around them. I need to get that lid open, Willa shouted over the storm and the gunfire. Cover me. Dan nodded, his face grim. He took a position against the well wall and began firing methodically up at the ridge, forcing Pike's men to keep their heads down. Willa took a deep breath and threw herself at the heavy wooden lid. It was waterlogged and heavy as stone. She strained, her fingers slipping on the wet wood. It wouldn't budge. It was sealed shut by years of neglect. The hatchet, she yelled. Dan tossed it to her. She caught it, its familiar weight a comfort. She began to swing, bringing the blade down again and again on the wood around the edges of the lid, trying to break the seal. Wood splintered. The sound of the hatchet striking the wood was lost in the roar of the storm. Another volley of rifle fire slammed into the stone wall, chipping off fragments that stung her cheek. Time was running out. With one last desperate heave, she swung the hatchet and the blade bit deep. She used it as a lever, putting all her weight into it. There was a loud crack and the lid shifted. She got her fingers under the edge and pulled. The lid scraped open, revealing a black, gaping hole. The smell of rot and stagnant water rose up to meet her. "I've got it!" she yelled. But as she looked down into the darkness, her blood turned to ice. A rope ladder, just as she'd expected. But hanging from the top rung, suspended just a few feet down, was the lockbox. And tied around it, like a fuse, was a bundle of dynamite. It was a trap. Silas had known they would come. He had been one step ahead of them the entire time. Suddenly, the gunfire from the ridge stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. Then a new voice echoed across the field. A voice that Willa hadn't heard in 17 years, but one that haunted every one of her nightmares. It was calm, controlled, and dripping with poison. "Well done, Willa," Silas called out. "I knew you wouldn't disappoint. Now be a good girl and send up my property." Willa looked up at the ridge. Pike and his men were parting, and a new figure was walking forward. He was older, dressed in a fine coat that the rain seemed to shun. Silas, and he wasn't alone. He had his hand gripped tightly around the arm of a thin, terrified woman with graying hair and haunted eyes. It was her mother. The world stopped. The rain, the wind, the fear. It all faded into a dull roar in the back of Willa's mind. All she could see was her mother, a ghost from a past she could never outrun, standing beside the monster who had created that past. Her mother's eyes met hers, and in them, Willa saw a universe of fear and apology. "You see, Willa," Silas said, his voice carrying easily over the storm. "I've learned a thing or two about leverage over the years. Your mother was much more cooperative this time around. She told me everything, about the deed, the map, her clever little plan to turn my own property against me." He gave her mother a cruel shake. "She led us right to you." A fresh wave of betrayal washed over Willa, so cold it burned. Her mother had sold her out. Again. "Let her go, Silas," Willa called out, her voice tight. "Oh, I will," he said with a sickening smile. "As soon as you send up my ledger, very carefully. As you can see," he gestured toward the well, "I've made some arrangements to ensure your cooperation. One wrong move, and everything goes up in smoke. The ledger, the well, and anyone who happens to be too close to it." Willa's gaze shifted from Silas's triumphant face to Dan, who was watching her, his expression unreadable. Then she looked back at her mother, at the raw terror in her eyes. And in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't betrayal she saw in her mother's face. It was sacrifice. Her mother hadn't led Silas here out of weakness. She had done it to be here, now, in this moment, to play one last, desperate card. "The trade is simple," Silas shouted. "The box for the woman, my past for yours." Willa knew what she had to do. She couldn't let Dan's chance for justice, his family's legacy, be destroyed. But she couldn't let her mother die either. She had to choose. She looked at Dan. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He just nodded, a deep understanding in his eyes. "Do what you have to do, Willa." She took a deep breath. "All right, Silas," she yelled. "You win. I'm sending it up." She leaned over the well, her hands reaching for the rope holding the lockbox. But her eyes were on the bundle of dynamite. The fuse was short. The rain had dampened it, but it was still viable. And then her mother did something no one expected. With a sudden, desperate strength, she wrenched her arm free from Silas's grasp and shoved him hard to the side. "Run, Willa!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "It's a lie! He'll kill us all anyway." Silas stumbled, his face contorting in fury. Pike and his men raised their rifles. But her mother's diversion was all Willa needed. She wasn't reaching for the box. She was reaching for the dynamite. With a flick of her wrist, she tore the bundle free from the lockbox. "Dan, now!" she screamed. Dan understood instantly. He fired 2 quick shots, not at the men, but at the heavy wooden lid of the well lying beside them. The bullets splintered the wood, kicking the lid off balance. At the same time, Willa lit the fuse of the dynamite with the small flame from her oil lamp. The fuse sputtered to life. "Get down!" she yelled, and threw the hissing bundle of dynamite not up at the ridge, but down into the deep, black water of the well. Then together, she and Dan kicked the heavy, bullet-damaged lid. It teetered for a second on the edge before crashing down, covering the hole and sealing the dynamite inside. They threw themselves to the ground, covering their heads as Silas and his men, realizing what was happening, began to scramble away in a panic. There was a deep, muffled thump that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. The ground shook violently. The stone wall of the well cracked and split apart. A geyser of mud and black water erupted from the cracks. And then, with a groaning roar, the earth around the well gave way. The entire structure, along with a wide circle of the surrounding land, collapsed inwards, creating a deep, muddy crater. The trap had been turned back on its maker. Silas, who had been closest to the edge, let out a scream as the ground disappeared from under him. Pike and two of his men were also caught in the collapse, dragged down into the churning mud and stone. When the shaking stopped, there was silence. The rain began to lessen, the storm finally breaking. The riders who were left on the ridge stared in horror at the crater, then without a word, they turned their horses and fled. Willa pushed herself up, her ears ringing. Mud covered her from head to foot. She looked at the crater where the well had been. Justice, served not by a bullet, but by the land itself. She looked for her mother. She was on the ground a few yards from the collapse, where she had fallen after shoving Silas. Dan was already at her side. Willa ran to them. Is she... Willa couldn't finish the sentence. Her mother's eyes fluttered open. She had a nasty gash on her forehead, but she was alive. She looked at Willa, and the years of fear and pain seemed to melt away, leaving only a deep, profound relief. I knew you were strong enough, her mother whispered, her hand finding Willa's. I knew you would be. Dan pointed towards the crater. At the very edge of the collapse, half buried in the mud but still intact, was the lockbox. The explosion had blown it clear. He retrieved it, his hands shaking slightly as he worked the simple lock. He opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. He looked at Willa, the mud on his face unable to hide the gratitude in his eyes. You did it, he said. We did it. Willa looked from the ledger in Dan's hands to her mother's tear-streaked face, to the raw, open wound in the earth where their past had finally been buried. The storm was over. The sun was beginning to break through the clouds, and for the first time in her life, Willa Gray felt the foundations of something solid being built beneath her feet, something that holds. Years passed the way they do out on the plains, slowly, and then all at once. The land healed. Grass grew over the crater where the well had been, leaving only a gentle dip in the earth, a soft scar to remember the storm by. The ledger did its work. With the proof of Silas's crimes, Dan was able to reclaim his family's name and their ancestral lands to the north. The empire Silas had built on lies crumbled into dust, and the stories of the families he'd ruined finally found justice. Willa's mother stayed, not in the small cabin, but in the nearby town, where she found a quiet peace she'd never known. The bond between her and Willa was rebuilt, not on forgetting the past, but on understanding it. They spoke of it, not as a wound, but as a story of survival they now shared. And Willa and Dan? They stayed on the land that had brought them together, the land that had tested them and ultimately saved them. They rebuilt the barn, stronger this time. They mended the fences, together. Their silence was no longer about hiding, but about a deep, unspoken understanding. They never spoke of love in the loud, flowery way some folks do. Their love was in the shared weight of a bucket of water, in the extra blanket left on the bed on a cold night, in the way he watched her from the porch as she worked in her garden. Children came eventually, a boy with Dan's quiet, watchful eyes, and a girl with Willa's stubborn chin. They were raised on stories of the land, of strength, and of the difference between being alone and being lonely. One evening, years later, Willa was sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky. Dan came and sat beside her, his presence as comfortable and familiar as her own heartbeat. You remember that day? She asked, her voice soft. The storm. The well. He nodded. I remember. You said your father believed the earth remembers the truth, she said, looking out at the land. I think he was right. She turned to him, a small, genuine smile on her face, a sight that was once rarer than rain in a drought. I think we finally built something that holds. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers, a hand that had seen her at her most broken and helped her become whole. We did, he said, and they sat there together in the quiet, watching the stars come out, no longer running from the past, but standing firmly on the future they had built from its ashes. This story is a reminder that the deepest scars are often the ones no one can see, and that true strength isn't about never falling down. It's about who you choose to help you get back up. It's about finding that one person who doesn't try to fix you, but simply chooses to stand beside you while you fix yourself. If this story of survival and justice moved you, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. And if you want to hear more tales that dig deep into the heart of what makes us human, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. Thank you for being here with me today. Your support means the world. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.